Thank you all for being here. When the orchestra started a couple of years ago, one of the things that was talked about from the very beginning was making sure that we recognized our local composers, and in particular, George Walker's name came up with a regular frequency, not just from people here in Montclair, but also from those within the orchestra industry, the music industry, recognizing what a treasure we had. So when we were programming this current season, we wanted to make sure that we involved George in that process, and we focused one of our concerts around his Lyric for Strings, which is his most well-known and most often performed piece for orchestra. I met George last August, about 2 weeks before he passed away, and we were able to have a nice conversation about how the orchestra is impacting the students that play with us, how his music has impacted, and how he would like his music to impact. But bringing us to where we are now, it seemed obvious to us when he passed that we want to have the people who knew him best be able to talk about him. So we've brought Gregory out, his son Gregory, who is a world-class violinist and professor out at UC Boulder, and his family is out here as well for honoring him tonight and also on the concert on Sunday evening. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Gregory Walker, who's going to start us off here.
George Walker's Look for solo violin.
to the discussion that we're going to have. Interesting little story that came up. Frank Schramm, who is a filmmaker here in Montclair, photographer, met George a number of years back and developed a friendship, and ended up producing a documentary short film about George, and so we're going to show that here briefly. Frank, if you would just for a minute just tell us quickly a little bit about the background here.
Thank you, Gregory.
Good evening, everyone. It's a real honor and delight to be here to share with you the celebration of the life of George Walker. I knew George for well over 14 years, and I had just moved to Montclair from New York City. I was there for 25 years, where I had my studio downtown in Greenwich Village, and my wife had triplets, so we moved to Montclair, who are now, by the way, 17 years old, and we're on the college tour. They're all juniors. But I have been interested in classical music for a long time, and my mother was a concert pianist. I grew up in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, and then moved to New York, and sort of like a triangle to Montclair. But it was in November of 2004, on a Friday evening, like tonight, and I was listening to WQXR in New York, and it was a syndicated program of the Detroit Symphony Orchestra, and there was this work that was so unique, and the announcer said, Symphony Number 3 by American composer George Walker. So right away I went to my computer and tried to see if it was available on Amazon, which it wasn't, and then I started looking into George Walker's website. So I sent an email, and he responded within an hour. And, of course, having no idea whatsoever that he lived in Montclair. So, anyway, the next day, after I asserted to him that I would be willing to pay for it, he said, not necessary. Postage? No, not necessary. And that afternoon, I was outside cutting the grass, came in, and there was this package, as you'll see in the film, that had my name on it, and it was his cassette of the Symphony Number 3. Anyway, years went on, we became very close friends. I almost felt like I was becoming his agent. I made calls for him, and everything became sort of like a photo op with George Walker. And I'm so honored to have spent the sort of twilight years with him and photographed him over the years. And one of the important things is his final work, which will be premiered next month, April 12th, in Seattle Symphony Orchestra in Seattle, Washington. And there's a video which is a part of that, his last work, Symphony Number 5, which will be presented out there. And anyway, I'm very honored. Certainly I'll take some questions afterwards that I'm sure that Gregory will as well. Enjoy the film.
I approach each work as a separate entity, though it's very difficult to speak about a general impression of the work because the works are all so different. And when I decide to write a particular work, I have in mind a certain objective and a certain perspective. Some works are more complex than other works. It all depends upon the medium I should say. And it all depends upon what I am trying to do that I think that I have not done before, or that I am not aware that anyone else has done. I composed the violin in front of my son, Gregory, who's a world-class violinist, because I wanted people to hear him, to have the opportunity of experiencing his special gift, special sensitivity, and the fact that more than any other violinist, professional, capable, virtuosic, he has managed to reveal the essence of my music more completely than other performers have done. And this was the work that I feel enables him to do that, to express both what I've written at the same time to demonstrate his enormous ability. there are elements that are not necessarily new that I've incorporated in a number of my works. These elements include quotes from various sources, and these quotes often have no direct connection to each other. Some of the quotes are associated with events and reminiscences that have occurred in my life. Others I used that resulted from my acquaintance with other music. So I have quoted spirituals, I quoted Broadway tunes, I quoted jazz and folk songs, and they are not intended to be more than fragments that are inserted into the music in a kind of mosaic without actually involving the development or the overall construction of it.
just going to have a little bit of a conversation here, talking through a little bit about your father and his impact on music, his impact on you, on the industry. First off, generally speaking, what was it like growing up in the Walker household?
Well, it could be loud at times. There was usually some kind of music, usually piano music, that was the soundtrack to the childhoods of my brother's names Ian and I, because not only did our father play piano incessantly, before he even envisioned being a composer, he actually had the beginnings of a career as a concert pianist and has a number of illustrious performances and some firsts for African American artists around the country. In addition, his wife, my mother, was also a pianist, and so it was just kind of a tag team going on back there in the background.
So, for you, do you have an earliest musical memory from that period of your life?
It was related to that. It probably was more closely associated with my mother, Helen Walker Hill, because as small toddlers, I don't know whether they were trying to get the attention of our parents who were otherwise preoccupied, but we always seemed to want to get close to the action, which involved getting close to what was typically an enormous grand piano parked in some kind of central location, whichever house we were living in. And so my brother and I would typically position ourselves underneath the piano, and we had our toys, and so you can imagine what the sound was like. It wasn't necessarily something that sounded like the music of George Walker we heard just now, because he'd be practicing the music of Beethoven and Brahms and Liszt, and under the piano, you're just immersed in the sound of whatever you're trying to do.
So were both you and your brother at that point both very affected by the music, and or was it just kind of there as a memory and you developed from there?
Well, I will say that if one hears some of this music by George Walker for the first time and thinks, well, it's a little different perhaps than what you usually listen to, if you grow up with that from an early age, I will say that that kind of complexity, dissonance, it sounds very normal. It's completely the new normal.
Right. So we look at, I'm a musician, I'm not a composer. Your father is a composer, and you, but, speaking of your father, where did he look for inspiration, whether it's, from certain genres of music, certain composers? Was there other non-musical aspects of his life that he turned to for inspiration when he was writing?
Well, on his behalf, I have to say that this question has arisen before, especially when people hear a style of music that seems different than what they're accustomed to. And when he would answer that, he was pretty adamant that this whole concept of inspiration, muse, divine guidance was not in his own experience, that it was sitting down at the piano, hard work, willpower, and maybe we don't ordinarily associate that with artists and music and this kind of la-ti-da existence, but it was something that, even if it wasn't challenging to begin with, he would ensure that it was so for him, that he would push himself to come up with things he hadn't come up with before, and that it was not supposed to be something that you coast on a magic carpet of inspiration where you would kind of have that kind of luxury. It was supposed to be just this exploration, this drilling. But that said, for someone who has a background as a successful concert pianist, all of those classical works, the same things many of us are familiar with, had to have seeped into his subconscious. And certainly aspects of what the old masters have done, techniques seeped into his own approach to composition. Just sounds a little different when he does it.
Right. So, I At first, after seeing the film, I thought you were going to say tomatoes. So when I spoke to him, he was in the midst of, and had been for a while, going through the process of getting his music recorded. All the records was going through, and he was working with them. What would your father want us to remember about his music? There's so many different forms, so many different styles that he took from it. What would he want us to remember about it?
Actually, his other son, Ian, is a photographer and a videographer and a filmmaker himself in Oakland, California. And he had been collecting some footage and some interviews of my father's. And a question that resembled that came up at one point from an interview that took place at Catholic University in DC just last year before. And our father's answer was kind of typical. It wasn't some kind of lofty aspiration of just what immortality was going to look like or how he could be remembered. He just kept cycling back to this idea that he knew that he was seeking to create music that satisfied himself. If it satisfied other people, that was nice as well. And then answering a really similar question, he was saying, my goal is just to make sure that what I have down on paper for the musicians to play is as accurate as possible. Just accurate, truthful, precise. And I think what you do with that is you see, beyond that, it was kind of moot. Concentrate on that. That's all one needs to focus on.
So, with those non-influences as they may be, your father as a person, what other types of pursuits did he have? I mean, I know we've heard from people walking in that they run into him at the grocery store, and we saw him on Grove Street when he was out in the front yard. What other things drove him beyond his music?
Speaking though of people who were walking in, there are a few faces I recognize, and probably a few more of you whom he's mentioned through the years. I've got to say that just being a member of this community for so many decades, it's something that while he might not have a huge circle of close friends, the interactions he would have going to the grocery store, working outside, were huge for him. His life was centered around kind of what Frank captured here, but because of that, any people he ran into, any kind words he heard, I live in Colorado, he'd tell me about them the next week. It was something that was so meaningful, the stability, the support of the community that is obviously something that we're sharing right now. I can't thank you enough for. Beyond that, while there was this really obsessive focus on not just music, but his kind of music, what he preferred, what he sought. Certainly from his childhood, there were other kinds of things going on. I think that even his grandsons who are here today inherited his love of sports. Not only was he someone one could actually see on Nishuane tennis courts, mountainside court tennis courts.
I played with him.
Yeah. She played with him, and I apologize for that. All over the
No, he
place.
was good. Classic. Oh my
Yes,
God.
it was these classic old school strokes.
Yep.
But before that, we have amongst the grandkids some basketball genes that have been passed through, and as a kid, he would pursue that as well. So interested in the physical as well as the intellectual. And you're right, the tomatoes definitely loomed large there. It didn't matter how few there were. I like the one angle Frank had gotten of his tomato bush. It was like maybe 2.5 tomato bushes. It looks like there's some kind of illicit, unzoned farm going in the background as a result of what's going on. And then some of you may have noticed these inexplicable stacks of technology that were actually located right in the middle of the living room. The first thing you see when you walk in, you have to make sure you don't run into it, because typically they were bigger than you were. Enormous stereos, unbelievably possessed audiophile.
So it really was just all about the music. So he referenced himself about different styles of music that impacted and that he might extract ideas from, whether it's jazz or folk music. With all the change in music and popular music that happened during his lifetime, was there anything that he wasn't okay with? Is there, or did he just, I know you've dabbled in rap and written a rap symphony. When you get into hip hop and rock and roll, how did he think about that, or did he incorporate it, or did he turn the other direction? What was his thoughts on all those other types of styles?
I know his thoughts were not fond. Yes, it's true that because of his advanced age, he'd been working, composing music for many, many decades, many different eras of contemporary 20th century music evolution. And to a certain extent, his music reflects that. But when he said that he pulled from the folk music and jazz and spirituals and all that, my understanding, my grasp of the situation is that he did so only under his own terms. So he would take maybe a little bit of a jazz tune, a little bit of a spiritual, but he would just grab the materials, just distill them, and make them his own, to the extent that most of the time, when he's done something like that with a piece of music, you cannot even hear it in there. He's completely transformed it. He only used it as kind of a point of departure, which is an aspect of his approach that leads into his attitude towards these kinds of music. I would say of almost any musician I've ever met, surely he was the purest of the purists. Did not smile upon even a lot of other contemporary composers who were composing music that you would think sounds kind of similar. He's one of the only musicians I've met who will even take a look at Beethoven or Mozart symphony. You're there listening to it and saying, that wasn't his best day, was it? So he was really going for something that he was not willing to compromise with. I imagine a number of you are looking forward to the Montclair Chamber Orchestra concert of the few great pieces, including his Lyric for Strings, one of the most beautiful, mellifluous, gentle pieces you can imagine. And for those of you, maybe the piece that I played at the very beginning, Bleu, was a little bit of a surprise. I can tell you that that solo violin piece I played, Bleu, was dedicated to a young violin student in our family who happens to be here today. His name is Grayson, my son. Grayson, why don't you go ahead and stand up? Yes. So, and I think that the idea was that maybe Grayson, learning how to play the violin, would someday play that piece. And as maybe a couple of you can relate, the piece, not easy, perhaps a little daunting, and as a result, I think Grayson was inspired to do some of the things he's doing now as up-and-coming hip-hop artist in Memphis. So that's sometimes all it takes to kind of
Well, speaking of some of the other music, we'd like to bring up your wife, Lori, and we're going to be you're going to be presenting the Sonata for Violin and Piano.
The Sonata Number 1 for violin and piano, unlike the first piece I played, which was written in 2009, we're stepping back to 1958, something that he wrote in Paris.
So, when I met your father, he came across to me as a very quiet and humble man. Do you feel that that is an accurate and fair portrait? Speaking as a musician, maybe not as a son.
Even as a musician, Andre. The thing is, any one of you may be able to imagine yourself in my father's shoes, in that one has this ability that one is certainly aware of. It also is receiving quite a bit of acknowledgement around the country, around the world, not the least of which would be from the Pulitzer Committee. At the same time, not only is there this daily struggle to produce music to a high standard, but also to try to persuade musical world and industry that this is worth disseminating, to try to find orchestras, organizations that have a sympathetic vision, like the Montclair Chamber Orchestra, Philadelphia Orchestra, long-standing relationship with the Detroit Symphony, Sir Simon Rattle and his groups. It's not something that hits people over the head, this beacon of, oh, this is absolutely something that my organization wants to invest in. As you're experiencing, it's challenging. You're listening to these notes flying past, and you're thinking, wow, you know, if I'm listening to Mozart, it's so much more relaxed than this. Why do I put myself through this? So what I'm saying is, if you are George Walker, you are having to put yourself out there every day with the help of Frank Schramm, the filmmaker, and everyone else he could enlist. And this is something that humility has a role in. For the most part, you have to have so much confidence. You have to have such a deep, burning, self-righteous sense of self-belief there. And I think that this is something that a number of people who know my father well would probably have sensed in him too. So humbleness, humility, yes, but you have to be able to put yourself out there, and that's something in addition.
Well, and I think that when you mentioned earlier that he wrote for himself, and if other people liked it, that's great. I mean, to me, that's the sign of a true artist, and we see, unfortunately, less and less of that. We see people writing for what people want, as opposed to writing for themselves and writing for what they feel. At the time, 200 years ago, when Beethoven was writing and he wrote his Ninth Symphony, people weren't impressed, right? So, but now we are 200 years later, and it's a completely different story. So I think history says a lot about what is great music, and I think that if you're writing for yourself, then that's important.
Well, it's funny you should mention Beethoven. A lot of people in music history will look back at all of the great musicians from the good old days there, certainly the ones before Beethoven, and they would say, the tradition before Beethoven, for even famous composers we know about and idolize nowadays, is that they at best had kind of a servant type role in their societies, in their employment and their commissions. And Beethoven is somebody, historians point out, say, this guy who was writing music that was very edgy for the time, believed in him so much that he would even go to the rich people who were paying him to write music, kings, queens, princes, and he literally said, there are thousands of princes in the world. There is only one Beethoven. So we could say Beethoven is humble, but and so he kind of set the bar for other, I think, composers, artists to kind of reach for out of necessity.
Just a little side note, that you mentioned that historically, composers and musicians were essentially servants. A little bit of trivia for you. That is one of the reasons why many orchestras still wear tuxedos
Yeah.
is because they were black and white. They were servants to the court.
You thought it was just because they liked dressing up.
Do you think that there was a particular work that your father was most proud of?
Well, like a mother with many different children, it's hard to choose one. I think that he would be aware of works that weren't getting as much love as the other ones, and kind of wanting to make sure that they got their time in the spotlight. And so some of these more complex later works definitely fall into that category. The Sinfonia No. 5 is going to be premiered by the Seattle Symphony next month, was something that at his age was such a challenge to compose that he really had it was just an extension of his life force, I would say. And the fact that Frank Schramm was able to collaborate with him on the imagery and pull in a bunch of other themes I think a number of people will be able to relate to for that premiere, I think will give him, my father, just retrospectively a chance to reach possibly a new audience with that. Same time, the lyric for strings that the orchestra is doing on Sunday is certainly something that's not only been very central to his reputation, but comes from a deep place in his own family and upbringing.
Now, switching gears a little bit, one of the things that your father has been most recognized for is being the first black man to have been awarded the Pulitzer Prize in Music, being the first black man to perform as a soloist with the Philadelphia Orchestra prior to that. What was your father's thoughts of his role as a black musician, a black composer, or a black performer in the world, and how much do you think that played into who he was as a person and as a musician?
Well, stepping aside from what I've been trying to argue, that his focus really was on getting these notes just right. That's kind of a full-time job in and of itself. He was brought up in a time not so different than now, where it was just so important for African Americans to have presentation to the greater world that was the best self. Role models were just central, given the conditions, given the discrimination, given just where blacks have been coming from. And when he saw that he could have that role within this side field of classical music, which is a little fraught in that it's not something that is automatically embraced by the African American community, given its point of origin. He was aware that he could be rolled out. He certainly was critical of people who had standing, who had a high profile in the community, and didn't dress well. They didn't hold themselves to the highest standards. He felt as if it was a lost opportunity there. So when it came time for his own career and all that, he was aware there was some time, and I think this was something that was even, I don't know, I guess it goes on a lot today too, the idea of first man on Mount Everest, first black musician to do this, first black athlete to do that. It's something that has value, it has a newsworthy aspect, it's something that again is kind of setting the bar. But there are also times in his career when he felt boxed in. Why am I not a great American composer? Why do I have to be considered black all the time? And so, honestly, depending on the circumstance, he would pursue one or the other, he'd be interested in one or the other. But at the end of the day, when it came to just creating this music, it certainly was not about color.
Speaking of you and your music and your playing and your own composition, do you hear your father's influence in what you do and how?
So, in addition to playing violin, I compose music. I've had all the graduate training. I've worked with a bunch of different orchestras, a bunch of great artists, and just like with performance, I was really aware at an early age of how accomplished my dad was, and especially since I started off with piano lessons, even as a little kid, you're just thinking, I am not going to get there. This is not going to end well. There's no way I can get out from under this shadow. So, as a result, as this whole composition career that I pursued from time to time came into focus, I think I probably overcompensated and started incorporating elements that I knew he would never, ever be interested in. A lot of electronic stuff, music that's influenced by hip-hop or electronic dance music involving video projections, and needless to say, he was maybe a little less supportive of my compositions than he was of my violin playing as I used to music. So if Frank had been interviewing him saying, well, how do you feel about your son not doing the violin, doing the composition, it would have been maybe more like crickets. But that's it as well, though. And there's some things that even go deeper than just the superficial look and the forces that are used in the composition. And I feel as if he instilled in me and probably a few other artists just this interest in pursuing craftsmanship, things that were more challenging both for the artist and also for the listener, that was where value lay off the road more traveled.
So over the past several months, you have been a guest at a number of events honoring him. I know you've been to events at Oberlin where he was an alumnus. Last week, and you were in Detroit with the folks there. What has the response been from the music community to his passing and to his works and his legacy?
It's interesting. There are kind of three layers I've noticed there. There's one that even though he never lived in Detroit and it's been a long time since he's been in Oberlin, people come up who have memories of meeting him or have memories of hearing a performance of his music decades ago, and they cherish those. And since hearing those kinds of things and meeting him, they followed him in these ways that kind of make them seem like community, which is pretty heartwarming. As well, you've got just this sense of respect, and kind of like you've been watching this artist for so long, and finally they're getting their just due, and this is the way it should be rewarded and acknowledged even after their lives are over for pursuing this approach to music so bravely, so individualistically. But the third thing is most of the people are music lovers, good hearts, love their Mozart, their Beethoven. They're listening to George Walker, and it's bracing. And at the same time, they just have to acknowledge what he stands for. Just with this mindset he had, with this drive, with this commitment, what he stands for that goes beyond music. And as well as I feel I've known my father through the years, I don't think that attitude is misplaced either. He was the real deal.
So when he passed, as I mentioned, 2 weeks before, I sat down with him. I was talking with him, and he was talking about commissions he was doing at the age of 96. He was doing a commission for the Curtis Institute. He was doing a commission for LA Philharmonic. Are those pieces going to be completed, or do you know if there are other pieces that are going to come out that we might expect?
Well, both the Curtis people and the LA Phil administration that had put together a lot of money to commission my father to write these pieces had some of those same questions. Wait, what? And yeah, the thing is, especially if we acknowledge my theory that in addition to being as humble as you like, he just was so driven and just day and night. People talk, just always pushing, always trying to get the opportunities, trying to disseminate what he had. In the last couple of years, he never lost that. At the same time as he was aware that he wasn't sure that he was going to be able to do these things. It was just, I mean, basics of getting up and down those stairs were starting to be more and more overwhelming. And then it's not easy writing this kind of music. There's so many different permutations, and so many, especially if you've just got your own intricate view of what it's supposed to mean. And so, long story short, he may have bitten off more than he could chew with those. And Frank Schramm and I, my brother, have looked around. We see fragments of where things started. And the fragments, they look like Beethoven's manuscript. Beethoven, one of the first composers who was actually lauded and respected for the fact that he had to struggle, that it didn't come easy for him. And so you look at Beethoven's scores, they're all scrawled over. He's angry, erased. Nothing. You can compare that to Mozart's score, which are always perfect because he already envisioned the thing completely in his own mind before he put it to paper. Beethoven's a struggle. My father's fragments, a mess. Very few of them. Not enough to work with. And I had to break the news. So for that reason, what Frank Schramm's working on with the Seattle Symphony and the Sinfonia No. 5, that pretty much constitutes the last work there that people can hear.
Well, with that, we do want to have one more piece. I think we're going to hear the lyric for 4 strings. Right.
I'm sorry to say that this short solo violin piece I'm going to play for you was not written by George Walker. I composed it. Unless you think that I'm gifted or something like that, I pretty much stole from my dad on this one. And for those of you who are able to attend the Montclair Chamber Orchestra concert on Sunday, you may hear some familiar strains because my father's piece, the lyric for string orchestra, is something that inspired this piece of music that I'm going to play for you right now. That's called Lyric for 4 Strings.
especially for coming out from Colorado and being here tonight. It helps us to understand your father better, make us feel a little closer. The orchestra will be performing Lyric for Strings on Sunday along with Mozart's Symphony 40, Mozart's Clarinet Concerto with Idiot Cho, the principal clarinet for the Metropolitan Opera, and Ollie Mustinen's None at 2. So a nice mix of lyrical music. If you're interested, we will be selling tickets at the back of the room here tonight, and we also have a number of your father's CDs. For those that are interested in hearing some more of his music, you're welcome to purchase those as well. So thank you so much for being here. Thank you all for having us.